The oil-stained floor of Miller's Auto Repair was slick with rainwater and engine grease when the hydraulic lift gave out and nearly crushed Hank Whitaker's hand. 1 second it held, whining under the weight of the ancient Chevy Silverado, and the next it failed with a violent metallic snarl, crashing down and missing him by inches. The impact rattled the bay, shook the ground beneath his boots, and sent a shiver straight up his spine. 1 more inch, 1 careless breath, and his left arm would have been shattered into more pieces than his bank account had ever held. Jesus! He gasped, stumbling backward, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might punch straight through his ribs. He stood frozen for a moment, grease-slick rag clenched in his hand, breath fogging in the cold Alabama air as if the shop itself was exhaling with him. The Silverado groaned on the lift, wobbling slightly, metal protesting like it knew exactly how close it had come to breaking the last working mechanic in the county. A voice echoed from the garage doorway, cutting through the ringing in his ears. "You all right, Whitaker?" It was Randy, the shop owner, leaning against the frame with a coffee cup that probably had more rust than cream in it. "Yeah," Hank muttered, forcing his voice steady. "Just another Monday." It was actually Thursday, but in Hank Whitaker's life, every day felt like Monday long, heavy and unforgiving. His hands shook slightly as he wiped them off, and not from fear. Fear passed quickly. Exhaustion stayed. It was 6:15 a.m., and he'd already worked 6 hours at the repair shop. Before that, he'd pulled a late shift bussing tables at Claiborne's Diner, smiling at strangers while his feet screamed inside worn-out boots. Sleeping wasn't something he did much of anymore. He caught fragments of rest between shifts, like a man trying to catch fireflies with a hole in his net. Outside, rain fell in slow, steady sheets, turning the cracked parking lot into a warped mirror of headlights, neon signs, and a puddled gray sky. Somewhere inside his jacket pocket, his phone buzzed. He didn't check it. He didn't have to. He knew exactly who it was. Rent reminder. 3 days overdue. Water bill reminder. Final notice. Bank account balance. $4,712. The only message he hadn't seen before sat at the bottom of the screen. One from Caleb, his 13-year-old son. "Dad, Mason took the last cereal. Rosie's crying again. Can we get pancakes tonight? So my teacher asked why I keep falling asleep in class." He read it twice. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. Because every word carried weight, and every sentence felt like a quiet accusation he didn't deserve, but couldn't escape. The rain thinned as the morning crept forward. He caught his reflection in the glass of the garage door. Early 40s, but his face looked older. It's too many night shifts, too many rejection letters. "You don't qualify for that loan." Too many polite condolences. "I'm sorry about your loss." Too many mornings waking up alone since Amy died, staring at the other side of the bed and pretending it didn't ache. He placed his hand on the hood of the truck, steadying himself as a familiar question rose in his chest, heavy and raw. Why does surviving have to feel so much like breaking? The sun finally peeked through the clouds as he left the shop and climbed into his sputtering Honda Odyssey, the engine coughing like it had bronchitis and arthritis at the same time. He tossed his tool bag into the back beside booster seats and mismatched backpacks. Remnants of a life always in motion, but never quite moving forward. He sat there for a second, engine off, just listening to the rain drum softly against the windshield. Then he said it out loud, to no one. Or maybe to God, or maybe to Amy. "You ever get the feeling the world's just waiting for you to give up?" There was no answer. Just the squeak of a loose windshield wiper dragging itself across glass. He started the engine. Their rented townhome was tired in the way people got tired. Used up, but still standing. 2 small bedrooms crammed with 4 kids. Bunk beds jammed against walls. Stacks of hand-me-down clothes. Laundry baskets everywhere because there weren't enough drawers. Bills stuffed into a drawer Hank didn't like opening. A photo of Amy taped to the fridge, smiling the way she used to before life got so heavy. Chaos was already awake. Mason, 8 years old, sat cross-legged on the floor, reassembling a broken toaster using Legos, convinced engineering was just imagination with instructions. Rosie, 5, was crying because her cereal floated too much. Sophie, 11, calmly braided Rosie's hair like she'd been doing it all her life. And Caleb, the oldest, stood at the sink, washing dishes. Wearing a shirt 2 sizes too small, shoulders tight, trying far too hard to be grown. "Hey," Caleb said without turning around. "We're out of milk and toilet paper." The internet got cut off again. Hank gave a slow, numb nod. "Okay, I'll fix it." Rosie climbed into his lap without asking, her head pressing against his chest, thumb in her mouth. She didn't care about bills or broken lifts or overdue rent. Just knew her dad felt like downpour rain. He held her there, breathing her in, grounding himself. He thought about his life. A man working 3 jobs, hiding overdue bills in glove compartments, telling his kids they were having an indoor camping night when the power got shut off. He barely noticed when Caleb spoke again. "Dad," Caleb said quietly, drying his hands on a towel. "Got mail?" Important looking. Hank looked down at the envelope. Thick, heavy, cream-colored paper that didn't belong in their mailbox. Morrison and Riley, attorneys at law, Blue Ridge, North Carolina. Inside was a single typed page. "Dear Mr. Henry Whitaker, we regret to inform you of the passing of Howard Brennan, your great-uncle, who named you sole heir to his estate, the Maragold Hotel, located in the Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. Please contact us within 14 days to arrange transfer of ownership." He blinked, read it again and again. Caleb looked up, brow furrowed. "We have an uncle?" Hank had no answer, only questions. Why him? Was this real? What kind of hotel was it? Some rotting building hidden in the woods? Was it even standing? But one thought spun louder than the rest. Why would someone I never met leave me anything? He lifted his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel tired. He felt something else. Curiosity, fear, hope, all tangled together. Finally, he exhaled. "We're going to North Carolina." The road narrowed as it climbed, winding into the North Carolina mountains like a ribbon knotted through mist and trees. Towering pines lined both sides of the 2-lane highway, their tops swallowed by low-hanging clouds. The Whitaker family van grumbled uphill, tires chewing gravel, shocks squeaking with every pothole. Inside, the kids bounced between awe and restlessness. "Are we almost there?" Mason asked for the 6th time, forehead pressed to the window. "No," Sophie said flatly, flipping a page in her tattered library book. "You asked 6 minutes ago, and we were 40 minutes away then. I just meant, like, emotionally closer." Caleb smirked from the passenger seat. "That doesn't even make sense, bro." Mason shrugged. "Neither does Dad owning a haunted hotel." In the rearview mirror, Hank cracked a small smile. "I don't own anything yet, bud. We're just checking it out. That's what people say right before they move into cursed places," Mason said. "I saw it in a movie." Hank didn't answer. His hands tightened on the wheel. Because nothing good ever fell into his lap without a catch. Not in his life. It had been 2 days since the letter. It's 2 days of explaining missed school. It's 2 days of borrowing gas money. 2 days of staring at that creased page and wondering what it wanted from him. Then the sign appeared through the fog. "Welcome to Blue Ridge Falls. Population 2,319. Sophie read it aloud, squinting. "Seems alive. It's probably cute," Caleb said. "Like one of those tourist towns with apple festivals and Christmas lights in October." Hank said nothing. The mountains watched silently as the road carried them forward. They reached the edge of town and passed a general store with a single dusty window, its shelves barely visible through grime that looked decades old. A diner stood farther down, boarded up tight, its faded sign creaking gently in the breeze, like it was trying to remember a time when people still came inside. A gas station followed, 2 working pumps, standing like tired soldiers beside a flickering closed sign. No Christmas lights. No festivals. No crowds. No laughter. Just stillness and rot, the kind that settled into places forgotten by time. Sophie leaned forward in her seat, pressing her nose to the glass. "Maybe the ghosts up here are friendlier than the ones we left behind." Hank glanced at her. Her tone hadn't been joking, and she wasn't looking at him, just out at the road. Quiet and pensive, in a way that reminded him far too much of her mother. Amy used to look like that when she was thinking about something she didn't have words for. "Maybe," he said softly. The road out of town veered sharply to the right, then climbed again. Gravel turned to dirt beneath the tires, crunching louder as the trees thickened overhead. The canopy swallowed what little sunlight remained until everything became a shadowy green tunnel, the world narrowing to a single ribbon of road. The GPS had died 30 minutes ago. its screen frozen like it had simply given up. Now it was just road signs, old and rusted, half covered in moss and leaning at odd angles, pointing places no one seemed to go anymore. "Is this even real?" Caleb muttered from the front seat. "Or are we in a horror movie?" "Shut up," Sophie whispered, eyes wide. "Don't say that when we can't turn around." And then, without warning, the trees broke. There it was. It's the Maragold Hotel. It sat in a hollow clearing at the end of the road, like something that had grown out of the mountain itself. 3 stories high, with a wraparound porch sagging in places, its posts bowed under the weight of time. Paint peeled like sunburned skin. Windows stared back dark and cracked. Vines curled up the walls and tangled along the gables, as if trying to pull the building back into the forest. The front tower had lost its weather vane, leaving only a bent rod pointing nowhere. The roof slumped like an old man's shoulders, weary and resigned. Rosie let out a quiet wow from the back seat. No one else said anything, not for a long time. Then Caleb finally voiced what they were all thinking. "Can't live here." "We're not," Hank said. "We're just looking." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He put the car in park. The van hissed and clicked as it cooled, sounding almost relieved to have made it this far. They stepped out one by one, boots and sneakers crunching against gravel, then weeds that clawed at their ankles. The air smelled like moss, rain, and old wood, heavy and damp. The only sound was the wind threading through the trees, whispering in a language Hank didn't understand but felt anyway. Mason kicked at a pinecone. "It looks like a monster. It looks like a memory," Sophie said, her voice distant again, like she was already somewhere else. Hank didn't respond. He walked toward the porch slowly. With every step, the front of the house felt taller, heavier, more real, the kind of real that pressed on your chest and dared you to keep going. The front stairs groaned under his weight, wood complaining, but holding. Rosie grabbed his hand tightly, her fingers cold despite the humid air. The door was made of dark oak, its stained glass panels shattered and patched over with mismatched pieces. He reached for the handle, half expecting it to crumble or come off in his hand. It didn't. It turned. The door swung open with a sound like a sigh. Inside, dust and silence ruled. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floors. A chandelier hung from the foyer ceiling, one bulb flickering dimly, alive only through some miracle of forgotten wiring. Faded wallpaper peeled in long curls, revealing patterns that hadn't been fashionable in half a century. Cobwebs bridged every corner like fragile architecture. A staircase curled upward, grand and crumbling, its banister worn smooth by hands long gone. "I think the Addams family lived here," Mason whispered. Sophie smirked. "We should have brought garlic." "That's for vampires," Caleb said. "Not ghosts." "Okay then," Hank muttered. "What do ghosts hate? Taxes?" The kids laughed a little too loud, the sound bouncing awkwardly through the hollow space. They moved cautiously through the first floor. What had once been the lobby, the dining room, and a wide lounge, where furniture lay draped in sheets like sleeping bodies. Sophie peeked under one and found a velvet armchair still intact, its color muted but rich beneath the dust. Kayla pointed toward the front desk. "What's that?" Behind the counter, a brass key hung on a hook, dusty and dull, labeled Suite 7. Hank's fingers closed around it. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cool, like it carried weight beyond metal. "Let's see what we've got," he said. They climbed the stairs. Boards creaked beneath them, but held. The second floor stretched into a long corridor lined with doors, each one closed, each one waiting. Hank found Suite 7 at the end, larger than the others, with its own transom window above the door. He unlocked it. The door opened easily. Inside was a sitting room, a bedroom, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub. Sheets still covered the furniture, but the dust here was thinner. Someone had cared or planned to. On the desk sat an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Henry Whitaker. He opened it. "Dear Hank, if you're reading this, then I was right. You came, I know you have questions, I know you're tired. But I hope you see this not as a burden but as a door. The Maragold is more than it looks. So are you. We don't get to choose our pain, but we get to choose what we do with it. Welcome home, Howard Brennan." Hank stared at the letter until the words blurred. Rosie tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, are we staying here?" Hank exhaled slowly. The air smelled like old cedar and rain-soaked books. "I don't know," he said. But something deep inside him stirred. Because the truth was, he wanted to. Even if it made no sense. Even if it was probably insane. Even if he had no idea what came next. He looked out the cracked window toward the trees and saw it again. The fog curling low across the ground like breath. Something about this place wasn't finished. And neither was he. Down the hallway, unseen, a door creaked open. Tomorrow they would start exploring, and the past would start to wake up. The sun broke through the mountain mist like a promise no one trusted. Thin light filtered through cracked panes of Suite 7, illuminating dust in golden streaks. The room smelled like old wood, distant mildew, and something older still, like stories sealed behind wallpaper. Hank Whitaker sat on the edge of the bed, bare feet on cold floorboards, rereading the letter for the 4th time. Howard Brennan's words lingered in his head. "We don't get to choose our pain, but we get to choose what we do with it." He didn't know the man, but somehow the words felt personal. A knock came at the door. Caleb peeked in, still in yesterday's hoodie, hair messy from sleep. "You good?" Hank folded the letter. "Yeah, you guys up?" Rosie's trying to brush her teeth with hand sanitizer. Mason's looking for ghosts. Sophie's reorganizing the books in the lobby by color, which she says is a coping mechanism. Hank chuckled dryly. "Sounds healthy." Caleb stepped in. "What now?" Hank looked around the room again, noticing for the first time how minimal the dust was here compared to the rest of the hotel. Furniture covered with clean white sheets. No signs of intrusion. It hadn't been maintained recently, but it had been kept ready. Someone had been waiting. He stood, stretching his back. We figure out why he left this to us. Downstairs, the kids were already scattered. Sophie was indeed sorting books with titles like the Carolina Registry 1912 and Blue Ridge Mineral Riches Volume 2. Mason had tied a belt around his head like a ghost-hunting bandana and was poking at a vent with a plastic fork. Rosie wandered the lobby, clutching a flashlight 3 times her size. Caleb stood behind the front desk, rifling through drawers. "Hey, Dad." Hank joined him, leaning over. "What is it?" Caleb pulled out a thin wooden drawer lined with felt. Small brass key sat alone in the corner, glinting faintly. There was no tag, but next to it lay a scrap of paper, ink faded, edges curled with age. On it, in the same handwriting as the letter upstairs, were the words, "Suite 7. Begin here." Hank picked up the key. It felt warm in his palm, not just from his grip, but as if it had been waiting for him specifically, tucked away all these years with patience. They returned to the room, the kids following close behind, curiosity humming around them like static in the air. "Ta-da!" Hank slid the key into the desk drawer beneath the vanity. The lock clicked with a soft finality that echoed louder than it should have in the quiet room. Inside was a smaller envelope. This time, there was no name, just a single line scrawled across the front in looping ink. "The truth is buried with the fire. Find the smoke." He read it aloud. "Is that like a poem?" Mason asked, chewing on a gummy worm he'd somehow found, the crinkle of the wrapper absurdly loud in the silence. Sophie leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "No, it's a clue." Hank looked at the key again, then slowly scanned the room. Everything was intact, carefully preserved. Everything except one thing. The painting above the fireplace was missing. The dust outline was unmistakable, clean edges framed by grime. Someone had removed it, and not decades ago. "Recently," Caleb said, his voice low. "Grab a flashlight." They searched Suite 7 thoroughly. Closets, drawers, behind the bathroom mirror, under the bed. Every creak and scrape made Hank's shoulders tighten. Then Sophie stopped near the wardrobe. "This doesn't line up with the floorboards." "Look." Hank ran his hand along the inside wall. There at the back was a seam, faint but deliberate, a false panel disguised by careful craftsmanship. It took 2 minutes and a pocket knife, but the panel finally gave way with a soft pop. Behind it lay a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings and a sealed manila envelope. On the front, written in bold block letters, "Maragold Fire, 1973. Hank opened it slowly. Inside were black and white photographs, blurry and smudged with age. At a hotel engulfed in flames, fire trucks lining the narrow road. smoke billowing into the night sky like a living thing. Beneath the photos was a typed list of guests who had checked in the night of the fire. Most names were crossed out in heavy ink, 2 were not. Howard Brennan, Loretta Jensen. Who's Loretta? Sophie asked. Hank didn't answer right away. He turned the paper over. On the back was a scribbled note. Loretta knows. She stayed when the others ran. He sat back on his heels, the weight of it settling in his chest. Okay, he said slowly. I think we need to find this woman. Maybe she's dead, Mason said bluntly. Maybe, Hank replied. But maybe she's not. Caleb held up one of the newspaper clippings. This article says she was the head chef, lived in Blue Ridge. We could ask around, Sophie added. Hank looked toward the window. The fog outside was beginning to lift, sunlight threading through the trees. All right, he said. Let's go into town. See who remembers. Blue Ridge Falls felt more alive by late morning, but only barely. A few locals leaned against the porch railings of the general store, watching the road instead of each other. A truck rolled by with hay bales stacked high in the back. The town carried a stillness that didn't feel peaceful, more like everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something they didn't want to see coming. They parked near the post office where an older man sat in a rocking chair, squinting beneath a faded cap as they approached. Can I help you? He asked. We're looking for someone, Hank said. Name's Loretta Jensen. Used to work at the Maragold. The man blinked once, then again. Slowly he leaned forward. You from that place? He asked. Hank nodded. The man studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp despite his age. Then he pointed down the road. Last house before the creek. Yellow siding. White fence. She don't answer the door much, but she's still there. Thanks, Hank said. The man didn't reply. They drove to the edge of town. The yellow house sat quietly beneath a willow tree, branches hanging low like protective arms. The porch swing was still, though there was no wind. A ceramic rooster guarded the mailbox. Hank knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Footsteps creaked inside, then silence. Finally, the door opened a crack. A woman in her 70s peered out. Steel gray hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes like glass marbles. I don't talk to reporters, she said flatly. I'm not one, Hank replied. I'm Howard's great-nephew. She stared at him. Something shifted behind her eyes. The door opened another inch. You came, she whispered. After all this time. Someone finally came. Hank held up the folder. He left this. And your name. Loretta stepped back and opened the door wide. Well, she said, then I guess it's time someone told you what really happened in that hotel. Hank looked over his shoulder at Caleb, who gave a small nod. Back at the hotel, unseen from the road, something stirred. A curtain moved in Suite 7, though no window was open. Beneath the lobby floorboards came a creak, like something shifting under weight or waking up. Tomorrow, the secrets would begin to surface. Because the past hadn't died in that fire. It had been waiting. The silence in Loretta Jensen's living room was thick, not empty. It was the kind of silence that grew between old walls, aged by memory rather than time. The steady tick of a grandfather clock echoed through the room, its pendulum swinging like a tired heartbeat. Loretta sat across from Hank in a faded armchair, hands folded in her lap, eyes studying him like a detective in a worn-out trench coat. Her house was cluttered but clean. Books stacked neatly, knitted throws folded with care. The faint smell of lemons and mothballs lingered in the air. I haven't said that name out loud in 20 years, she said. The Maragold. You were there, Hank said. The fire. I was, she replied, and I stayed when others ran, because I knew what they were trying to hide. She reached beside her and pulled out a weathered photo album. Inside were black and white pictures of the hotel in its prime. Staff in crisp uniforms, guests laughing beneath chandeliers. Toward the end, the photos darkened burnt edges, smoke-stained frames, destruction frozen in grainy stillness. It wasn't an accident, she said, tapping the final photo. Everyone assumed faulty wiring or the stove, but it was deliberate. Someone wanted to erase something, or someone Hank swallowed. Howard? No, Loretta said softly. Howard was the target, but he survived. Barely. She rose slowly, joints protesting, and crossed the room. From a drawer, she pulled out a sealed envelope and handed it to Hank. He gave this to me a week before the fire. Told me if anything happened, I was to keep it safe. He thought someone in the family was planning something. Hank opened the envelope. Inside were schematics of the hotel original blueprints. But something stood out immediately, a hand-drawn edition. A room beneath the foundation, no label, just a faint outline and a single word, vault. I've never seen that room, Hank said, brow furrowing as he studied the drawing. And we've walked almost every floor. That's because it's not on any of the modern plans, Loretta replied. It's older, original to the first structure. Howard believed something was hidden down there. Something tied to the Brennan family legacy. She paused, eyes dimming. He never found it. But maybe you can. Hank folded the papers carefully and slipped them into his jacket. Loretta, he said, his voice quiet but firm, eyes searching hers. Why me? Why would he leave this place to someone he never met? She looked at him for a long moment, studying the lines on his face, the weight in his posture. Then she said, because you're the only one who didn't ask. The fog was heavier by the time Hank returned to the hotel, rolling in low and thick, swallowing the base of the building until the Maragold seemed to float above the earth. The kids had passed the afternoon, exploring more rooms. Caleb had found a record player that somehow still worked. And now soft jazz drifted faintly through the empty hallways, the music echoing like a memory that refused to fade. Sophie met Hank on the stairs, her arms full of old guest ledgers. We've been organizing the front desk, she said proudly. You wouldn't believe how many people stayed here in the 50s. Movie stars, politicians, someone named E. Presley, but it might have been a prank. Hank smiled, distracted. Where's Caleb? In the dining hall, she said. He found a trapdoor. Hank blinked. Oh, what? They hurried down to the dining room, which still smelled faintly of ash and charred wood. Caleb stood over a loose floorboard near the bar, flashlight in hand. It was wedged shut with nails, Caleb said, but the wood's rotted underneath. I think it leads somewhere. Hank knelt beside him, pulling out Loretta's blueprint. The trapdoor aligned perfectly with the drawing. The vault was real. Get Mason and Rosie, Hank told Sophie. We're not going down until everyone's upstairs. 5 minutes later, the younger kids were settled with books and snacks in Suite 7. Hank returned with a crowbar in hand. Caleb stood beside him, eyes wide with something caught between fear and adrenaline. You ready? Hank asked. Caleb nodded. The trapdoor groaned as it lifted, coughing up decades of dust. A narrow staircase descended into darkness, the air below colder than the mountain outside. Hank clicked on his flashlight. Stay close. They stepped down into the unknown. The basement felt more like a cave than part of a hotel. Stone walls pressed inward. Pipes dripped steadily. Earth crunched beneath their boots. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, thick with damp and silence. At the bottom of the steps stood a heavy metal door. It had been bolted and welded shut at some point. Scratched into the rust were the words, "Some things stay buried for a reason." Dad, Caleb whispered, running his fingers over the letters. Hank examined the welding. Old sloppy. Someone sealed this in a hurry. Maybe during the fire. Maybe right before. He turned to Caleb. This is the room from the drawing. The vault. What's inside? Caleb asked. I don't know, Hank said. But your great-uncle thought it mattered. They stared at the sealed door in silence. Then Caleb said, voice tight, whatever happened here, never left these walls. The words hung heavier than the stone around them. They returned upstairs without opening the vault. Not yet. Hank needed tools and time. The past had waited this long. Could wait one more night. By dusk, the hotel had gone quiet again. Rosie slept curled on the couch. Sophie read beside her. Mason sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing ghost traps in crayon. Caleb sat with Hank by the fireplace, staring into the cold grate. Do you believe in curses? Caleb asked. Hank shook his head. Not curses, but I believe in consequences. Caleb nodded thoughtfully. If we find out the truth, will it change anything? Yeah, Hank said. It changes everything. Later, after the kids were in bed, Hank sat alone in the lobby. The blueprint rested in his lap, the fireless hearth at his back. He stared at the drawing of the vault and the words scrawled beside it in Howard S. handwriting. Legacy. He didn't know what was behind that door. But he knew the fire hadn't just been about burning down a building. It had been about hiding something powerful, something that could either save his family or destroy what little they had left. Tomorrow, he'd open it one way or another. Because the past wasn't buried, it was locked in a room. And he finally had the key. The wind had teeth that morning. Cold rolled down the mountainside in sharp waves, curling through broken shutters and rattling the windows of the Maragold. It was early, still gray, but Hank was already downstairs in the dining hall, toolbox at his feet, eyes fixed on the trapdoor. He hadn't slept. His body begged for rest, but his mind was a hammer. The door sealed, rusted, screaming to be opened, had burrowed into his thoughts like a nail driven into the wood of his chest. There was something down there, something left unfinished by fire, family, or fear. And Howard Brennan had trusted him to find it. Caleb entered quietly, hands in his hoodie pockets, face pale in the early light. "You sure about this?" Hank looked up, his voice hoarse from a night of silence. Truth doesn't hide, it waits. Together, they pried open the trap door again. The stairs groaned, like they remembered the weight. Dust floated in the flashlight beams like breath made visible. At the bottom, the vault door waited. Welded seams, rusted hinges. The old warning still carved across its surface. Some things stay buried for a reason. Hank unzipped his bag and pulled out a battery-powered angle grinder. He handed Caleb the flashlight and slipped on his goggles. The grinder shrieked when it met metal, sparks flying in a scatter of orange. The hotel seemed to flinch at the sound. Upstairs, footsteps stirred, but Hank kept going. Steel peeled back strip by strip. Years of silence hissed away. After 20 minutes, the last weld popped. The door creaked forward inch by inch until darkness spilled into the corridor like ink. Hank stepped inside first. The vault was a long, narrow chamber, stone-lined walls, low ceiling, colder than the rest of the basement. On one wall sat a built-in shelf, dusty but undisturbed. On it rested a wooden box, a cloth-bound ledger, and an envelope yellowed to the color of old teeth. Hank reached for the envelope. Inside was a letter in Howard's handwriting. "Hank, if you found this, then I'm gone, and you're braver than I ever was. Everything in this room was never meant to see the light again, but the truth has weight. It doesn't rot, it waits." Inside the ledger, you'll find records from 1952 to 1973. Names, transactions, and something more. Money that never made it into the family books. Secrets that didn't belong to me but became mine the day I said nothing. If you want to walk away, I won't blame you. But if you open that box, you'll be holding the bloodline by the throat. Choose carefully. H.B. Hank read it twice. Then he opened the ledger. Pages of names, dates, bank accounts, payoffs, code words scribbled in the margins. The past finally began to breathe. He didn't understand all of it, not at first, but he didn't need to. The numbers spoke louder than comprehension ever could. Columns of figures marched down the page like an army. Offshore accounts routed through islands he'd never visit. Shell corporations folded into other shell corporations. Payments dispersed in careful increments to people identified only by initials. Clean, clinical, designed to survive scrutiny. Then his stomach tightened. Some of the initials weren't anonymous to him at all. He'd seen them upstairs etched into dedication plaques. Carved faintly into banisters, written in looping ink inside guest books that smelled like dust and old perfume. Brennan names, family names. This wasn't money sitting idle in the dark. It was leverage. A living diagram of influence and silence. A map of manipulation passed down like an heirloom no one admitted holding. Slowly, Hank turned to the wooden box. It wasn't locked. It somehow felt worse. Just a simple latch, as if secrecy alone had been considered protection enough. He flipped it open. Inside were documents, bundled carefully, edges soft with age. Birth certificates. His own, his mother's, and a third, Howard Brennan Jr., born 3 years before Hank, deceased at age 5. Hank's breath caught, sharp and painful, like the sudden drop on a broken stair. His hands began to shake as he unfolded the newspaper clipping tucked into the corner. The headline stared back at him from 1960, bold and merciless. Brennan family tragedy, young heir dies in river accident. The photograph was grainy, the ink bleeding into the paper, but the resemblance punched him square in the chest. Same eyes, same tilt of the head. The boy looked like Caleb. Hank swallowed hard and reached for the last item in the box. A child's drawing, creased and fragile. Crayon on cheap paper. A crooked house, stick figure waving. The words Uncle Howard scrawled in uneven red, signed in blocky, uncertain letters. Hank, age 9. His throat tightened until breathing felt optional. He remembered it now, clearly, but enough. His mother standing over him at the kitchen table, insisting he write a thank you note. A box of old toys had arrived from a cousin he barely knew. He'd drawn the picture to avoid writing too many words. He hadn't thought it mattered, but it had. That one small act, that forgotten kindness, that was the thread. Howard hadn't chosen him out of obligation or bloodline technicalities. He'd chosen him because Hank had acknowledged him, because Hank had remembered he existed when everyone else moved on. Behind him, Caleb shifted. Dad. Hank turned, eyes burning, the weight of decades pressing down on his spine. Caleb gestured to the spread of papers. What? What is this? Hank exhaled slowly. It's the reason they set the fire, he said. To erase all of this. The money, the names, the leverage. Howard hid it so no one could use it again. Caleb's finger hovered over a page. These people? Are they still alive? Some Hank said quietly. I think some are very much alive. He closed the box, deliberate, final. We take this upstairs. We keep it safe. Back in the lobby, morning sunlight spilled through shattered panes, warming dust and peeling wallpaper. Life moved on around him, oblivious and stubborn. Sophie stood at the stove, flipping pancakes in a cast-iron skillet she'd unearthed like treasure, sleeves rolled up as if the Maragold had always been home. Rosie sat cross-legged on the floor, humming softly while brushing a doll's hair. Mason had constructed a crooked cardboard sign and taped it to the front desk. Maragold and enter, if you dare. Hank walked past them with the box held tight against his chest, his mind still underground. They worked through the afternoon. Sophie cross-referenced names with town records, brows furrowed in fierce concentration. Caleb sketched a sprawling family tree, arrows and notes branching like veins. Mason labeled everything confidential in thick marker and delivered snacks like a clerk on a mission. Rosie offered commentary and approval in equal measure. Then the knock came. A tall man stood in the doorway, mid-50s, dark coat, pressed slacks, eyes that didn't blink enough. The kind of stillness that watched more than it moved. Mr. Whitaker? He asked. That's me. I'm Pastor Elijah Bell. I knew Howard Brennan. Near the end, Hank hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in. Elijah's gaze swept the lobby ceiling, lingering. Still standing, he murmured. This place was built on secrets and prayers. I'm surprised it hasn't sunk. He turned to Hank. You found it. The vault. Hank didn't answer. Elijah smiled faintly. I don't want anything. To tell you this what you reholding is something people would burn the world to bury. I'm starting to understand that. They'll come, Elijah said gently. He handed Hank a card. When they do, you'll need someone who still believes in justice. And then he was gone. That night, Hank locked the box behind the false panel in Suite 7 and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind claw at the building. The Maragold wasn't just an inheritance. It was a shield if he could hold it. The knock came at 7:12 a.m. 3 slow taps. Precise. Rehearsed. Hank froze in the hallway as the kids argued downstairs about syrup ratios. Through the front glass, a black SUV idled. The man at the door wore a navy blazer over a cream turtleneck, trim beard, polished confidence. Expensive in a way meant to intimidate. Mr. Whitaker, he said smoothly. Jackson Crail. Brennan Family Holdings Trust. Hank felt the threat behind the smile like cold steel. I'd like to talk, Jackson said. In the lobby, Hank replied. I've got kids. Jackson's eyes cooled. Very well. Seated, legs crossed, Jackson got to the point. Ownership and control aren't the same thing. We're offering a buyout. Walk away clean. Hank leaned forward. Now walk away from something that still remembers your name. Jackson tilted his head. You're making this difficult. I get that a lot. Jackson stood, smoothing his blazer, as if the conversation had been nothing more than a polite inconvenience. "You should think carefully," he said evenly. "Doors only stay open for so long." Hank rose too, meeting him eye to eye. "I don't want your door," he said. "I've got my own now." Jackson paused at the threshold, hand resting on the frame. For the first time, something real slipped through the polish. "Then let me be clear. What you found in that vault isn't just paper and secrets. It's leverage. Leverage makes enemies." With that, he stepped out into the cold. The black SUV roared to life, gravel snapping under its tires as it vanished down the road, leaving only dust and silence behind. By noon, the dining table was buried again under files. Caleb sifted through them methodically, eyes sharper now, older somehow. The moment Hank entered, Sophie looked up. He was from the family, wasn't he? "Worse," Hank said. He was the family's lawyer. Caleb didn't look surprised. "So they know." "They know about the vault," Hank replied. "They know everything." "Which means we're on a timer." The words settled heavily over the room. Offshore accounts, laundering trails, influence bought and sold like stock. Caleb had started tagging names with bright sticky notes. "This one," he said, tapping the page. "D. Lansing. He's everywhere. Payments, signatures, wires. Not a Brennan, but deep." Sophie flipped a folder. Lansing was mayor of Blue Ridge Falls in the 70s. Hank's jaw tightened. Then the town remembers more than it admits. That afternoon, Hank and Caleb drove into town. The general store clerk Patty was warm until Hank said the name. Then her smile vanished. "That man left a mess wherever he went," she said, arms crossing tight. "You knew him?" Hank asked. "Knew of him? Backroom deals? Whisper politics?" "Nothing ever stuck, but everyone knew." She hesitated. "When the Maragold burned, he disappeared. Did he come back?" Once Patty said, just long enough to make sure his name stayed out of the fire report. By nightfall, the wind was climbing. Plastic rattled over broken windows. Rosie played receptionist with a dead phone. Then Caleb handed Hank a document. A notarized statement from Howard, unsigned but addressed to the state attorney general. A confession, a map, a warning. "We finish this," Caleb said quietly. "It could blow everything open. It would also make us a target," Hank said. "They already came once. Tires crunched outside. Everyone froze. 2 SUVs this time. Lights off. Engines idling. We lock it down," Hank said. Now, crowbar in hand, he stood by the door. This wasn't ownership anymore. It was survival. Rain fell by morning, steady and cold. The Maragold creaked like a ship under siege. The SUVs still waited, watching. "They want us scared," Hank said. So he flipped the board. He packed fast files, flashlight, gloves, Howard's letter. He pressed a slip of paper into Caleb's hand. "If anything happens to me, this is the safe combination." "This isn't about a hotel," Hank said, gripping his son's shoulder. "It's about legacy. It's about refusing to disappear." "We are the truth," Caleb said softly. Hank smiled tight. "And let's make sure they hear it." He slipped into the woods. Rain soaking his boots, heading for a cabin at the edge of town. Elijah Bell opened the door before Hank knocked. "They're watching you." "I know," Hank said, stepping inside. "I opened the vault." Elijah nodded once. "Then give me what you've got." Hank unzipped the bag. "There's a name you should know. Lansing." Elijah's face darkened. Jackson's smile thinned, the charm finally shedding like dead skin. "You won't find them," Hank said again, steadier now, even with blood at the corner of his mouth. "You're too late." Jackson studied him, really looked this time. The broken chair, crowbar clenched like a final argument. The silence of a house that had already made its choice. "You don't understand," Jackson said quietly. "This was never about finding files. It's about reminding people where power lives." Upstairs, the Maragold groaned as if in answer. In the vault room, the air felt colder, heavier. Rosie pressed her doll to her chest, whispering to it like it could hear her fear. Mason had gone unusually quiet, fingers tracing the scratched word on the wall. Vault. Sophie kept watch at the seam of the false panel, flashlight beam steady despite the tremor in her wrist. Caleb crouched near the floor listening. Every sound upstairs came through the old bones of the hotel boots on wood, Drawers ripped open, glass shattering. Each noise landed like a countdown. "They're tearing it apart," Sophie whispered. "Let them," Caleb said. "Dad planned for this." In the lobby, the man in the leather jacket ripped open a desk drawer and cursed. Sunglasses kicked over a side table, wood splintering. "Nothing," he snapped. Jackson's eyes flicked back to Hank. "Last chance." Hank straightened, pain screaming through his ribs. "You came here thinking this place was just rotting wood and bad memories," he said. "Forgot one thing." Jackson raised a brow. "It remembers who tried to burn it." The lights flickered. Just once. Just enough. The hotel exhaled. A pipe burst somewhere in the walls, sending a shriek of steam through the hall. Sunglasses staggered back as water poured across the floor. The leather jacket slipped, hit the ground hard, swearing. Hank didn't waste a moment. He lunged, slamming the crowbar down again, this time cracking it across Sunglasses' forearm. The man screamed and dropped. Jackson stepped back sharply, composure cracking at last. "Enough," barked. "Get up." But the Maragold was done waiting. Upstairs, a window slammed shut on its own. In Suite 7, the dresser Sophie had dragged groaned and locked into place like it had been bolted. The false panel behind them vibrated, then settled, seamless, invisible. Caleb felt it then. Not fear, alignment. Like the building had drawn a line and decided which side it stood on. Downstairs, Hank backed toward the stairwell, breath burning. "You should go," he told Jackson, while you still can. Jackson's eyes darted not to Hank, but to the ceiling, to the walls, to the sound of the place closing in. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "This isn't over," he said. "Truth burns fast." "Good," Hank said. "We've got water now." Sirens cut through the distance, faint at first, then louder. Jackson froze. Hank smiled, slow and exhausted. "Anonymous tips travel fast," he said, "especially when they come with receipts." Outside, red and blue lights began to stain the fog. Jackson swore under his breath, sharp and furious. He nodded once to his men. "Move." They didn't touch Hank again. They didn't need to. The threat had already shifted. As they retreated through the broken door, Jackson paused, turning back just long enough to lock eyes with Hank. "You think this ends with arrests?" he said. "Men like me don't disappear." Hank wiped blood from his lip. "Neither do ghosts." The SUVs roared away just as police cruisers crested the drive. In the vault room, Caleb heard the sirens and finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Sophie sank against the wall, laughing once, sharp and hysterical. Rosie clapped, not understanding but sensing the change. Mason grinned. "Told you we weren't going to die." Minutes later, Hank found them, bruised, bleeding, but standing. He pulled them all in, holding on like the building itself might shake them loose. Outside, officers moved through the fog. Phones rang. Somewhere, a news alert lit up a screen. The Maragold stood scarred, awake, unburned. And for the first time since 1973, the truth was no longer trapped behind walls. It was walking out the front door. The blast echoed through the Maragold like thunder trapped in a coffin. Wood splintered. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The sound didn't just stop the man in sunglasses. It stopped everything. Time, breath, thought. Jackson's hand froze inside his coat. No one spoke. Smoke curled lazily from the shotgun barrel in Hank's hands, the smell sharp and metallic, mixing with mold and old pine and fear. His stance was solid despite the blood crusted at his collar, despite the tremor running through his muscles from pain and exhaustion. He didn't blink. "I won't miss next time," Hank said quietly. The man in sunglasses backed away first. The leather jacket followed, eyes flicking nervously between Hank and the children hidden behind overturned furniture. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jackson looked unsure, not frightened exactly, but recalculating the way predators do when prey suddenly bares teeth. Sirens wailed again in the distance. Closer now. Jackson exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. "This ends badly for you," he said. "You've crossed lines you don't even understand." Hank cocked the shotgun slightly. "It's funny. That's what men say right before history remembers their names for the wrong reasons." Caleb stepped forward then, backpack slung tight across his shoulders, dirt smeared on his hands, eyes hard with something that hadn't been there yesterday. You should leave, he said. Right now. Jackson looked at him, really looked tanned. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition. Not of the boy, but of what the boy carried. The second vault, Jackson said softly. Not a question. Caleb didn't answer. That was answer enough. Then another. Slowly, carefully, like retreating from a live wire. This isn't over, he said again. But this time the words sounded thinner, less certain. No, Hank agreed. It isn't, but it's not yours anymore. Jackson turned sharply and barked orders under his breath. The men moved fast, not running, but not lingering either. Within seconds, they were gone. Engines roaring, gravel spraying, as the SUVs tore down the drive and vanished into the fog. Silence rushed in to replace them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Rosie whimpered softly, the sound small and human and grounding. Sophie was there instantly, pulling her close. Mason crawled out from under the table, eyes wide. Did we win? Hank lowered the shotgun at last. His shoulders sagged like the strings had finally been cut. We survived, he said, at step one. Police lights flooded the clearing moments later. Doors slammed, voices shouted, flashlights swept the trees. Hank stepped forward, hands visible, crowbar discarded, shotgun set carefully on the floor. Behind him, the Maragold stood quiet, watching. Hours later, long after statements and flashing lights and the hum of generators faded, the hotel settled into a new kind of stillness. It's not dead, not asleep, waiting. In Suite 7, the kids sat on the floor, backpacks open. Evidence spread out like a ritual offering, documents, photos, the recorder, the confession tape wrapped carefully in a towel. Sophie wiped dirt from the label with reverent care. Caleb stared at the list of names again, the one that hurt the most. Margaret Whitaker, their grandmother. She tried to stop it, he said finally. Not a question, a decision. Hank, sitting on the edge of the bed, with his ribs taped and his face stitched, nodded slowly. Howard marked the guilty, he said, but he also marked the brave. The ones who paid for saying no. Sophie swallowed. So this place, it didn't just burn because of greed. No, Hank said. It burned because someone tried to do the right thing too late. Outside, the wind moved through the broken trees. Softer now, less angry. The Maragold had given up its last secret. And in doing so, it had chosen its future. Because history hadn't been erased, it had been returned. And this time, it had witnesses. The intruders backed off. For a moment, no one moved. Dust hung in the air, drifting slowly through the shattered light fixtures like ash after a fire. Jackson straightened his coat with deliberate calm, adjusted his collar as if this were still his world, still his stage. This isn't over, he said, voice tight, brittle with fury he could barely contain. It is for you, Hank replied. Then the night answered. Headlights blasted through the front windows, white-hot and blinding. Red and blue strobes sliced across the lobby walls, splashing color over cracked wallpaper and fallen beams. Sirens wailed long, relentless, cutting through everything Jackson thought he still controlled. Doors slammed, boots hit gravel. Sheriff's Department, hands where we can see them. Deputies poured in from 3 county cruisers, weapons raised, movements sharp and practiced. The sound alone stripped the power from the room. Jackson froze. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hands. One by one, his men followed. No speeches now, no threats. Deputy Rhodes approached Hank, eyes scanning the shotgun, the debris, the kids huddled nearby with backpacks still strapped tight to their shoulders. We got a dozen calls after that live stream, Rhodes said. Reporter out of Asheville forwarded us a full dossier. Ledgers, names, timestamps, we've got warrants. He paused. Federal agents are already en route. Rhodes looked at the kids again. Caleb, Sophie, Mason. Rosy faces pale, eyes too old for their ages. Y'all did good, he said quietly. Really damn good. Hank exhaled for the first time in hours. His shoulders sagged just a little. The fight drained out of him, leaving something raw behind. Dad, Caleb whispered, stepping closer. There's more, deeper names, Grandma's name. Hank turned so fast it hurt. What? She was on the wall, Caleb said. But we think she turned against them. We think she tried to do what you're doing now." Hank stared at his son, this boy who had stepped into fire and come out carrying truth instead of fear. A black man who'd spent his life holding ground suddenly felt something crack open in his chest. Pride tangled with grief. Anger softened into something dangerously close to forgiveness. "We carry her name," Hank said quietly. "But now, get to decide what it means." Behind them, the Maragold groaned as more vehicles arrived, radios crackling, voices overlapping. Yet inside, something shifted. The hotel exhaled, long, deep, not haunted, not cursed, just ready. What had been buried had finally been heard. Morning came with the smell of burnt wood and stale coffee. The Maragold was quiet again, but not the fearful kind of quiet. This was the silence that follows a reckoning, the kind that settles after something massive finally breaks open. Deputies had cleared out hours earlier. Federal agents cordoned off the second vault with yellow tape and numbered tags. Forensics would arrive soon. Jackson and his men were already gone, charges stacking fast. Money laundering, obstruction, conspiracy, and likely worse. None of it felt like victory. Truth never did. Hank stood alone in the dining hall, staring through a broken window as dawn painted the mountains in pale gold. Sophie was upstairs helping the kids pack, just in case. The authorities had warned them to lay low. Tension cuts both ways. But Hank couldn't stop seeing the name. Margaret Whittaker. His mother's name, carved into concrete like a wound that never healed. He heard footsteps. Caleb entered, eyes rimmed red, exhaustion etched deep, but steadied by purpose. In his hands was something wrapped in cloth. "We found this," Caleb said softly, "in the second vault." He unwrapped it and placed it on the tableland old leather-bound journal, cracked with age. Gold initials glinted faintly. M.W. Hank picked it up as if it might break. Inside was her handwriting, sharp, slanted. June 3rd, 1972. They said it would just be bookkeeping, just numbers. But today I saw my first real ledger, and I think I know where this money comes from. Hank flipped forward. August 19th, 1973. Howard warned me. Said once I took the job, they'd own me. I thought I could stay clean. I thought I could keep Hank out of it. No one stays clean. His throat tightened. October 5th, 1974. They're talking about a purge. Howard says they want to burn the Maragold. He's building a hidden room. For the truth. I don't think I'll make it out. Hank turned the final page with trembling hands. November 14th, 1974. If my name ends up on the wall, let it mean I tried. That I fought. That I didn't go quiet. Hank, if you've ever read this, I did everything I could to protect you, Evan, if it meant becoming one of them to destroy them from the inside. The words blurred. Hank didn't wipe his eyes. She didn't give up, he whispered. She went under. Caleb nodded. Howard knew. That's why he marked her and why he protected you. He left it to you because he knew you'd finish it. Hank closed the journal. It's not finished. Caleb frowned. No, Hank said, looking around at the beams, the scars, the breadth of the building itself. Because this place still carries them. This isn't just a crime scene, he continued. It's a memorial. By noon, they began clearing the vault, what they were allowed to take. Ledgers, blueprints, architectural plans Howard had hidden away. We could make it a museum, Mason suggested, through a mouthful of cereal. Ghost tours, Rosie added. It's real ghosts. Sophie laughed, but Hank didn't. What if Hank said we open the Maragold as truth? A place where history doesn't get rewritten by whoever shouts the loudest. They called Elijah. He loved it. Offered funding. Journalists. Coverage. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. But it was real. That evening, as plans spread across the front desk, a knock came gentle. A woman in her 60s stood there, gray hair neatly pinned, a small cross at her throat. Mr. Whittaker? She asked. She handed him an envelope. I was Margaret Whittaker's nurse. She asked me to deliver this when the truth got louder than the lies. Inside was a single note. Hank, if this reaches you, the story survived the silence. I was never proud of what I became, but I was always proud of you. The Maragold stood quietly behind him, listening. Hank held the note from his mother, letting the words settle deep in his chest. Keep fighting. Make the Maragold mean something again. Make our name something worth saying. His hands curled around the paper. He whispered to himself, steady, resolute, I will. That night, the Maragold's lights burned bright long after the darkness should have claimed it, not from fear, but from purpose. For the first time in 50 years, the hotel didn't feel cursed. It felt alive, awakening. The wind raced through empty corridors like voices that refused to leave. Rain battered the windows, each wave a percussion note, lifting the sense that the building was no longer sinking, but drifting steadied, poised, ready. A week had passed since the leak went public. The media had descended in swarms, at first local reporters, national crews, even an intrusive documentary team, but most had moved on to flashier scandals in larger cities. What remained was raw truth and the messy consequences it left behind. Hank stood atop the roof with Caleb and Sophie, watching as electricians rewired the old weather vane, reconnecting it to the grounding line after 40 years of darkness. Generators hummed in the parking lot. The city had finally rerouted utilities, compelled by evidence proving the property had been deliberately disconnected decades ago. Funny, Hank muttered. All that power stolen by men who never thought they'd have to give it back. Caleb adjusted his cap, scanning the tree line. They tried, but they didn't count on one thing. What's that? Sophie asked, eyes fixed on the horizon. Hank smiled faintly. They never do. Back downstairs, Hank's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his coat pocket and frowned at an unfamiliar name. Charlotte Anders, Washington, D.C. This is Hank, he answered. A calm, authoritative voice replied, Mr. Whitaker, I'm Charlotte Anders. Department of Justice, Division of Historic Corruption Review. I've been assigned your case. Hank's brows lifted. You're 6 decades late. No laughter on her end. We've received the Brennan files, everything from both vaults. The scale of evidence is staggering. The Attorney General has opened a multi-state investigation. You may be called to testify before Congress. Hank echoed halfway down the staircase. I'm a hotel janitor with 4 kids in a toolbox. Also, Charlotte continued, you're the whistleblower of the largest concealed financial conspiracy in Appalachian history. Hank leaned against the railing, absorbing the weight. Charlotte added, we'd also like to propose the Maragold be designated a National Historic Site. Pending approval, it would receive federal funding, legal protection, and national recognition. Sophie, overhearing only part of the conversation, mouthed, What's happening? They want to make us permanent, Hank whispered. Charlotte added one last caution. With permanence comes responsibility, restoration, records, memorials. This place must tell the full story without edits. I wouldn't know how to whitewash it if I tried, Hank said. Good, she replied. This place doesn't need polishing. It needs remembering. By Monday, preparations for the exhibit began. The old ballroom, once the venue for opulent gatherings and secret meetings, was being transformed. Files, artifacts, and Howard Brennan's complete audio confession would be displayed. Sophie drafted the narrative panels. Caleb organized the timeline. Mason made cardboard signs. Criminal stuff here and no touchy-touchy. Rosie naturally bedazzled them. Sophie noticed first. One box from the second vault, labeled Ledger 9, was actually a film reel. Caleb retrieved an old projector and spent the afternoon repairing it. When it flickered to life, the grainy image displayed August 12, 1974. Howard Brennan appeared, 10 years younger, standing beside a woman in a nurse's uniform, Margaret Whitaker. Caleb froze. That's Grandma. Margaret appeared nervous, hands folded. Howard prompted her, state your full name. Margaret Lynn Whitaker, financial assistant to the Brennan Foundation. Why are you making this statement today? Margaret looked into the camera, because I need to tell the truth before they erase me. She produced documents, copies of dispersal records, legal campaign donations, slush funds, and shell company fronts. Sophie's jaw dropped. She had been the original whistleblower. Hank watched, stunned, as his mother's face flickered across the ballroom wall. Margaret continued, I was told it was bookkeeping. I was told it was harmless. Then they stopped telling me anything. That's when I realized I was dangerous. I want my son to grow up knowing the truth even if I disappear, even if my name is erased. Howard's voice returned. "Do you know the risks of this testimony?" "Yes," she whispered. "But if no one speaks, it happens again." The screen went black. Silence followed. Caleb whispered, "She started it all." Hank didn't speak for a long moment. Then he placed his hand on the screen where her face had been. She wasn't just a name in concrete, she was the match. That night, Hank stood on the hotel porch. The sky turned soft pink and blue. The storm had passed. Elijah joined him with 2 mugs of strong tea. "You good?" he asked. "No," Hank admitted. "But I'm getting closer." They sipped in silence. Elijah broke it. "Your mom came to me before she made that tape. She told me what she planned. I offered to hide her. She wouldn't run. She said hiding the truth made her sick. The only way to break a legacy is to drag it into the light and let it scream," she said. Hank smiled, tears threatening. "Stubborn, righteous. That's her." Elijah handed him an envelope. Inside, a certificate from the governor's office. The Maragold Hotel was now a protected historical site. At the bottom, in honor of Margaret Whittaker, "For courage and silence, for truth and darkness," Hank whispered. "She's permanent now." Elijah looked across the hills. "She is." For the first time, Hank felt no weight of her name, its only wings. Morning sunlight streamed through cracked stained glass, casting warm shards across dusty floors. The Marigold wasn't haunted. It was alive, scarred but breathing, the breath of history finally allowed to speak. Hank walked slowly, fingers tracing the grooves of the walls. He paused by the brass plaque near the stairwell, letting the story settle around him. The Marigold was ready to tell it. It was small, understated, just a name, Margaret Whittaker. Beside it, another, Howard Brennan, the last keeper of the truth. Above them, carved into a beam, was a phrase Caleb had burned in with a soldering tool. "Truth doesn't rot in the dark. It waits." The words had been hard-earned. The Marigold had reopened the previous week not as a hotel, not as a tourist trap, but as something between a museum and a warning. Visitors could walk its halls, read the ledgers, listen to Howard Brennan's confession, and even view the second vault, now sealed behind bulletproof glass under federal protection. The building still creaked and groaned in storms, but it no longer carried fear, only memory. Downstairs in the kitchen, Caleb and Sophie prepared coffee and pastries. Volunteers from Elijah's church had joined, filling the air with the scent of cinnamon and hope. Rosie drew little maps for visitors, while Mason wrote fun facts on index cards, some wildly exaggerated but all charming. Hank sat in his father's old chair in the dining hall, watching morning guests arrive. Families, journalists, students. Even a veteran who had stayed in room 6 back in 1968. Everyone came for different reasons, but all left with the same gift. Truth not just about crimes and lies, but about the silence that allows corruption to flourish. Charlotte Anders had visited 2 days prior with more news. Indictments were moving forward. Lansing had fled the country, but extradition was underway. Others had confessed, some carrying guilt heavier than their children's lives. But what stayed with Hank was Charlotte's parting words. "This isn't just about corruption. It's about those who refuse to disappear." Sophie slid into the seat beside him with 2 mugs of coffee. "They're calling you the Ghost Keeper of Blue Ridge now," she said with a smirk. Hank rolled his eyes. "Sounds like a B-movie title." "Better than Hotel Janitor Turns Whistleblower," Caleb added, dropping into the seat across from them. Rosie handed Hank a crayon drawing of the Marigold with a heart above it. She had drawn herself on the roof wearing a cape. "This is me saving the hotel," she said. "You're missing the fire and the shotgun," Mason added helpfully. "Let's leave the shotgun out of the children's exhibit," Sophie said with a laugh. They laughed together, a deep, full laugh that filled the space where tension had once lived. Hank folded the drawing and tucked it into his coat pocket. "You know," he said, "I used to think this place was cursed. That my mother's name was a weight, that legacy meant carrying someone else's sins." He looked at his family. "But now I think legacy is a choice. You don't carry what they gave you. You carry what you build from it." Caleb nodded slowly. "So what are we building?" Hank asked. "A future," Caleb said. "One that remembers," Hank answered. "One that tells the story right." Outside, the wind had softened. It carried change now, not warning. As the last morning guests filtered in, Hank stepped onto the small stage in the center of the room, where the bar had once been. He cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. The room hushed. "I want to thank you all for being here," he began, voice steady. "Not just because it helps keep the lights on, but because it means something more. This hotel was built on lies, silence, and power that fed itself by taking from others. People disappeared here, stories were erased, names were buried, but not forever. You're here because someone kept a record, made a tape, carved names into concrete so they wouldn't vanish. They tried to erase people like Howard Brennan and Margaret Whittaker, but they failed. Truth doesn't rot, it waits. It waits for someone willing to pick up the torch, for someone brave enough to say, 'That's not how it ends.'" He looked at his kids. "Don't. And now it's our job to carry it forward, to build something honest, something better." Silence fell, loud but warm, lasting. Later that night, after the doors closed and the lights dimmed, Hank found himself alone in the vault. He ran his fingers across the concrete where his mother's name was etched. This time, it didn't hurt. It glowed. He lit the candles Sophie had placed on the ledge beside the journal, preserved in glass, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Not with revenge, not with shame, but with light. The Maragold had once been a place where darkness thrived. Now, it was a place that told the truth, and the truth finally had a home. For all of you following along, remember, every story has a keeper, and every secret has its day. Truth waits for those brave enough to find a tan to carry it forward. Like Hank and his family, sometimes the most haunted places are the ones ready to teach us the most. Keep watching, keep questioning, and never let silence win. Fate Tales will always be here, telling the stories that matter.